Story 1. It started innocently enough, almost like a harmless mistake. A package, unmarked, appeared on my doorstep. No return address. I assumed it was a mix-up, a delivery meant for someone else. But when I opened the first box, the air around me seemed to chill. Inside was a stuffed bear, faded, worn, and eerily familiar. It wasn't just any bear. It was my bear, the one I hadn't seen in years. The kind of toy you only keep if it holds a memory, something precious. But I hadn't thought of that bear in ages, let alone seen it. I didn't order this. The next day, another package arrived. This one was smaller but just as unsettling. It was a wooden puzzle, a toy I had spent countless hours playing with as a child. The edges were scuffed, the pieces smooth from use, exactly as I remembered it. My hands trembled as I turned it over. No return address. No note. Nothing. It felt like someone was pulling threads from my past, stitching them together, piece by piece, and sending them to me. Over the next week, the packages kept coming. A yellowed photo album filled with forgotten family pictures. A locket I used to wear as a child, tucked into the velvet pouch from my old dresser. Every item was steeped in nostalgia, yet they felt invasive, wrong. As though someone had been digging through my life, picking out fragments only they could have known were important. Whoever it was, they had an unsettling precision, an unnerving understanding of who I was. I started asking questions. My neighbors hadn't seen anything unusual. The post office was no help. The packages came from random locations, cities I'd never been to, some with only generic postal codes. Whoever was sending these things was careful, deliberate. Then came the package that made my stomach twist. It was small, about the size of a shoebox. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, were a pair of earrings. I recognized them immediately, the ones I had worn to my high school prom. A flood of memories came rushing back, laughter, music, the swirl of a dress. But alongside the warmth was something darker, a shadow I couldn't quite place. It felt like whoever had sent the earrings wasn't just gifting me memories, they were reclaiming them, as if they knew too much about moments I had locked away. By then, I couldn't dismiss it as coincidence. Someone was forcing me to confront my past. Each package was a deliberate reminder, a piece of a puzzle I hadn't realized I was solving. Then the final package came. It was larger than the others, wrapped more carefully, almost like a gift. Inside was a letter, handwritten on brittle yellowed paper. My heart stopped when I saw the handwriting. It was my mother's. But my mother was gone. She had passed away years ago. The letter was brief and chilling. You were always meant to remember. The past will find you when you least expect it. It was signed with a single initial, L. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, yet the message was something she would never have written, not in life. I clutched the letter, my mind spinning. How could this be possible? I began to dig. I searched through old photo albums, made phone calls to people I hadn't spoken to in years, revisited places I thought I'd left behind forever. But the answers I found only led to more questions. Then, late one night, while flipping through a stack of photographs, I found it. A picture of a summer camp group, taken when I was about 12. There I was, grinning in the front row. Surrounding me were familiar faces from my childhood, except one. One boy stood apart from the others, his expression unreadable. His name was Luke. Luke had been my closest friend that summer. But he disappeared right before high school, vanished without a trace. No one ever talked about him after that, as though he had been erased. And now, years later, it hit me like a lightning bolt, Luke. He was the only person who could have known about these items, these moments, these buried pieces of my life. The realization was like ice in my veins. The packages, the letters, the unsettling accuracy of every memory, they weren't random. They were deliberate. And they all pointed to him. But why? Why now? The thought gripped me with a cold dread. Luke wasn't just sending me pieces of my past. He was forcing me into a game. A twisted, personal puzzle, one I couldn't escape. I realized that until I unraveled it, until I uncovered what happened to Luke, and why he was haunting me, I'd never be free. But the deeper I looked, the more I feared the truth. Because sometimes, the past doesn't just find you. It hunts you. Story 2. It started so subtly that at first, I convinced myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. A quick glance at the bathroom mirror as I adjusted my hair or smoothed my shirt, and for a fleeting moment, something felt off. My reflection seemed a beat too slow, lingering for a fraction of a second longer than it should have. I brushed it off as fatigue, a symptom of restless nights. But the second time it happened, I wasn't so sure. I had just stepped out of the shower, the mirror fogged with steam. As I wiped it clean, I caught sight of my reflection. It was subtle, but unmistakable. My reflection held still for just a moment longer than I did, its movements trailing behind mine like a delayed echo. I blinked, staring at the glass, half convinced it was just the haze of hot water clouding my mind. But when I blinked again, my reflection didn't. It stood there, perfectly still, its eyes fixed on mine, unblinking. Watching. The next few days, it became impossible to ignore. Passing by mirrors or catching glimpses of myself in windows, I'd notice the smallest irregularities, a delayed motion, a gesture that didn't quite match mine. At first, it was minor enough to dismiss, a hand raised a split second too late or a head tilt that lingered. I told myself it was stress, the weight of work and sleepless nights catching up to me. But then my reflection started doing things I wasn't doing. One morning, while brushing my teeth, I glanced up, and froze. My reflection smiled. Not a faint, tired smile, but a wide, eerie grin that stretched too far, a smile I hadn't made. My hand stopped mid-motion, the toothbrush hanging from my lips as I stared. The grin lasted only a few seconds before melting back into my neutral expression, mirroring me once again. But the moment lingered. It didn't feel like I was looking at myself anymore. Over the next few days, I tried to avoid mirrors altogether. But reflections are everywhere, shop windows, car mirrors, even puddles. I couldn't escape it. And it didn't stop. One evening, after a long, exhausting day, I stood in front of the hallway mirror, brushing out my hair. As I dragged the comb through my tangled locks, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My reflection wasn't brushing its hair at all. It was staring at me. Not a passive, glassy stare. It felt focused. Intentional. Its eyes didn't blink. Its expression didn't change. It just watched. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. But my reflection didn't move. It stayed there, frozen in place, its gaze boring into me. From that moment on, I couldn't pretend anymore. This wasn't a trick of the light, or my mind playing games. Something was wrong. I started testing it. I'd make exaggerated movements, waving, jumping, anything to see if it would follow. Sometimes it did, perfectly synchronized. But other times, it didn't. One afternoon, I raised my hand in a slow, deliberate wave, and my reflection didn't move. It stood there, still as stone. Then, it grinned again, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far, too long. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a chair in my rush to leave the room. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt its gaze on me, unblinking and relentless. By morning, I was done running. I decided to face it. I stood before the bathroom mirror, my fists clenched, my heart hammering in my chest. This time, I wouldn't look away. I wouldn't blink. I stared directly into its eyes, daring it to move. It didn't blink either. But then, slowly, it began to move, not to mimic me, but on its own. The way it moved was wrong. Its limbs twisted and contorted in ways my body never could, bending at angles that shouldn't be possible. Its grin returned, wider and darker than before, stretching until it seemed to split its face. And its eyes, they changed. The light in them flickered, fading into an empty blackness that swallowed the rest of its features. I stumbled back, terror surging through me like a wave. For the first time, I understood, this wasn't me. It never had been. It was something else. Something pretending to be me. I ran, locking myself in my bedroom, but even then, I couldn't escape the feeling that it was still watching me. The reflection wasn't just in the glass anymore. It was in my mind, lingering in the dark corners of every room, waiting. The next morning, I left the house. I couldn't stay there, not with it lurking in every reflection. But no matter where I went, it followed. In shop windows, car mirrors, even the darkened screens of phones and TVs, I saw it. It's still there, always at the edge of my vision, always just a step behind. I've stopped looking in mirrors altogether, too terrified of what I might see. But the truth is, I don't think I need to look anymore. Because now, I don't even know if I'm the one on this side of the glass. Or if it already is. Story 3. The night was heavy with an unnatural stillness, broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling into the darkness. Exhaustion weighed down my eyelids as I climbed into bed, ready to succumb to sleep, when a sound drifted from the living room. It wasn't the familiar groan of old wood or the hum of the fridge. No, this was different. A faint murmur, unmistakable, like a television playing softly. My breath caught in my throat as I bolted upright, heart thudding in my chest. I reached for my phone, fumbling slightly, and opened the security camera app. The feed loaded slowly, the spinning circle taunting me, each second amplifying the dread clawing at my chest. When the image finally appeared, I froze. There, on the couch, was a figure, a stranger. They sat as though the room were theirs, their posture casual, relaxed, their face half-shrouded in shadows. The flickering light of my television danced across their form. My television. I hadn't turned it on. The air in my lungs seemed to crystallize as I stared at the screen. The intruder wasn't frantic or hurried. Instead, they reached for the remote, flipping lazily through channels, the flicker of images casting eerie glows across their still features. My mind raced. The doors were locked. Every window secured. There was no way they could have gotten inside. I rewound the footage, desperate for answers. The feed showed an empty living room, still and lifeless. Then, without warning, the figure appeared. No sound. No movement. Just, there. Materialized from thin air. Panic gnawed at the edges of my resolve as I considered calling the police, but what could I say? That someone had broken in by defying the laws of reality. My fingers trembled as I turned up the camera volume, hoping to catch a sound, anything. The faint hum of dialogue from the television filled the silence, a movie I didn't recognize, playing on a TV I hadn't touched. Gathering what little courage I could muster, I slipped out of bed, my phone clutched tightly in one hand. My bare feet made no sound on the carpet as I crept toward the bedroom door. The hallway stretched ahead, dark and silent, shadows shifting uneasily under the thin sliver of moonlight. I dared a glance at the camera feed again. My stomach lurched. The figure was no longer on the couch. The camera didn't show them moving. They were just, gone. Frantically, I cycled through the other feeds, the kitchen, the front door, the back porch. Nothing. The house looked as it should, but the oppressive weight of wrongness hung in the air. Then I heard it. A creak. Soft. Deliberate. Close. I muted the camera feed, straining to hear, but the house fell silent again, its stillness now suffocating. My trembling hand brought the app back to the hallway camera. There, just at the edge of the frame, a shadow shifted, a flicker of movement in the periphery, as if whoever it was knew precisely where the camera's blind spot began. I hovered over the emergency call button, the logical part of me screaming to dial for help. But something deeper, more primal, rooted me in place. Drawing attention to myself felt like a mistake. The shadow vanished. Minutes ticked by, each one an eternity. My pulse thundered in my ears. And then it came, the faint sound of a door creaking open. My blood ran cold. The guest room door, just down the hall. Switching the feed, I found only darkness. The light in the guest room was off, and the screen showed nothing but an impenetrable black void. I couldn't take it anymore. I dialed 911, my voice barely above a whisper as I described the intruder. The dispatcher's calm reassurances felt distant and hollow, each second until the police arrived dragging on endlessly. When the knock finally came, I nearly jumped out of my skin. I moved the dresser I had shoved against the door and let the officers in, hastily explaining what I'd seen. They swept through the house, their flashlights cutting through the dark. Nothing. No signs of forced entry. No stranger lurking in the shadows. The guest room door was closed, just as I'd left it. They reviewed the footage with me, but to my horror, the recording from earlier was gone, replaced by static during the time the figure appeared. The officers suggested I stay somewhere else for the night, their tone kind but skeptical. I nodded, too shaken to argue, and began packing a bag. Before leaving, I glanced one last time at the living room. The television was off. The room was still, the silence now deafening. But then, as I turned to go, something caught my eye. An indent on the couch cushion. Faint, but unmistakable. As if someone had just been sitting there. Story 4. It began as a mundane task, clearing out the attic. A chore I had put off for years. Dust swirled in the dim light filtering through the small, cracked window as I sifted through forgotten trinkets and long-abandoned keepsakes. That's when I found the box. Nestled among old books and moth-eaten clothes was a dusty, cracked-screen phone, an outdated model, one I didn't recognize. It wasn't mine. Something about it held my attention, though I couldn't explain why. Curiosity got the better of me. I wiped off the grime and brought it downstairs. Plugging it in, I half expected it not to work. But after a few tense moments, the screen flickered to life. The home screen was unremarkable, populated with generic icons. It seemed like any other phone from years ago. But the notification bar at the top told a different story. Dozens of unread messages. I tapped the messaging app. That's when it started. The conversation seemed ordinary at first, short exchanges about plans, apologies, questions about someone's day. But as I read on, the tone shifted. Casual chatter gave way to desperation, the messages growing frantic. One thread caught my attention. It began innocuously, with a simple, "Hey," but quickly spiraled into frantic pleas for a response. The more I read, the more disturbed I became. The messages referenced events and places I had never been, yet they were written as if I had intimate knowledge of them. My stomach turned as familiar names began to appear: my childhood home, the park near my current apartment, the diner I visited every week. Still, I tried to rationalize it. A coincidence, maybe. Or some elaborate prank. But then I noticed the timestamps. These weren't relics of the past. They were recent, some messages were only days old. My chest tightened. The unease grew into outright dread when I realized the messages weren't just about places, they mentioned secrets. Things I had never told anyone. Fears I had buried deep. One message stopped me cold: check the attic. Look carefully through the boxes. I froze, glancing upward toward the ceiling. The quiet creak of the house settling suddenly felt ominous. Hoping for answers, I opened the call log. Nothing. No outgoing calls, no incoming calls, just silence. How could a phone filled with messages have no record of any conversations? It felt deliberate, as if someone had wiped the device clean, leaving behind only the breadcrumbs they wanted me to find. Still, I couldn't stop myself. I opened the photo gallery next, bracing for random images of strangers. Instead, I found snapshots of my life. My living room. My car. The path I took to work. The angles were strange, taken from a distance, as though someone had been watching me. My hands trembled as I shut the phone off. I wanted to throw it away, to pretend I had never found it. But the questions gnawed at me. Who had owned this phone? Why were the messages so personal? And how had it ended up in my attic? The next day, I took it to a repair shop, hoping the technician could trace its origin. He worked on it for a while, then handed it back with a strange look. "There's nothing here," he said. "The serial number's been scratched off, and the storage is wiped, except for the messages and photos." He suggested I let it go. That night, I dreamed of the phone. In the dream, I was scrolling endlessly through messages, each one more personal than the last. They spoke directly to me, referencing memories I'd long forgotten, or tried to forget. I woke up drenched in sweat, the phone still on the table where I'd left it. Unable to resist, I powered it on again. A new message had appeared. Time-stamped just minutes earlier. "Why did you stop looking?" My blood turned to ice. The message was addressed to me. I had never entered my name, never provided any personal information. How did it know? I spent the rest of the night in the corner of my living room, clutching my knees, staring at the phone as though it might spring to life. Every sound in the house felt amplified, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator. I didn't sleep. By morning, I knew I had to get rid of it. I drove to the edge of town, to a wooded area where I used to hike. I left the phone on a tree stump and walked away, refusing to look back. But even as I drove home, I felt eyes on me, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. Days passed. Life returned to normal, or so I thought. Then, one evening, my own phone buzzed with a notification. I picked it up, dread settling in my gut. The message was simple. "Why did you leave me behind?" My hands shook as I stared at the screen, the room suddenly feeling colder, smaller. Somewhere, out there, or perhaps closer than I dared imagine, the phone was waiting. And it wasn't done with me yet. Story 5. The knocking woke me from a restless sleep. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but the sound came again, sharp, deliberate, and unyielding. I glanced at the clock, 3 a.m. My stomach churned as I swung my legs off the bed, my movements slow and hesitant, each second stretching as the rhythm continued, echoing through the suffocating stillness of the night. The hallway was shrouded in darkness, and every step toward the front door felt like wading through quicksand. My breath hitched as I peered through the peephole, expecting to see someone, anyone. But there was nothing. Just the dim, yellow glow of the porch light. The knocking had stopped. Swallowing my fear, I unlocked the door and pulled it open. Cold air rushed past me, cutting through the warmth of the house. The street was empty, eerily still under the pale glow of the streetlights. "Hello." I called out, my voice a fragile thread that barely broke the silence. The only response was the faint rustling of leaves. I lingered for a moment, feeling a chill that went deeper than the night air, then closed and locked the door, securing it as tightly as my trembling hands would allow. I turned, intending to go back to bed, but then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. Breathing. My pulse quickened, and my muscles froze. It wasn't coming from outside. It was behind me. Slowly, I turned, my eyes scanning the shadow-drenched living room. Streetlights cast flickering patterns on the walls, their glow distorted by the curtains. The breathing grew louder, steady and deliberate, as if something was standing just out of sight. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding in my ears. The breathing stopped. Silence. I took a cautious step forward, my bare feet brushing against the cold floor, and flicked the light switch. Harsh yellow light flooded the room, revealing nothing. The furniture was undisturbed, the windows shut tight, and yet the oppressive feeling of being watched lingered, heavy and stifling. I forced myself to shake it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination. I turned off the light and retreated to my bedroom, but as I reached the doorway, it came again, breathing, closer this time. My skin crawled, and I spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty. Backing into my bedroom, I closed the door and pressed my weight against it, trembling. The sound had stopped, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. Crawling back into bed, I pulled the covers over me, but sleep was out of reach. Every creak of the house, every distant noise outside seemed amplified, crawling under my skin. I stared at the door, waiting, watching, as the hours dragged on. When dawn finally arrived, its fragile light seeping through the curtains, relief washed over me. But as I stepped into the hallway, a prickling unease returned. Something was off. I couldn't say what, but the air felt heavier, the silence too complete. It wasn't until I reached the front door that I noticed it, a faint smudge on the glass. A handprint. I stared, dread coiling in my stomach as I unlocked the door and stepped onto the porch. The handprint was on the inside. The street stretched out before me, calm and empty, a stark contrast to the storm raging in my mind. The day passed in a haze of unease, every shadow a threat, every sound a warning. I checked the locks. Twice. I left every light on, but as night crept in, so did the dread. Midnight found me sitting on the edge of my bed, too tense to sleep, when it came again, the knocking. Louder this time. More insistent. I stayed frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe as the sound filled the silence, relentless and mocking. My chest tightened, my hands gripping the flashlight and phone as if they could protect me. And then, it stopped. Hours passed in a suffocating stillness until dawn finally broke. Venturing out, my legs shaky, I found the house unchanged, locks intact, windows secure. But the unease was suffocating, a constant presence that refused to be dismissed. And then I saw it. On the porch, folded neatly, was a single piece of paper. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. The words, scrawled in jagged, uneven letters, burned into my mind. I'll see you tonight. The street was empty, the world outside calm. But inside, a storm raged. Clutching the note, I stepped back into the house and locked the door. My heart pounded, my thoughts spiraling into chaos. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. It had just begun. Story 6. Walking home late that night, I couldn't shake the prickling sensation of being watched. The streets were eerily quiet, as though the night itself was holding its breath. Only the faint hum of distant traffic broke the oppressive silence. My footsteps echoed softly on the pavement, but every so often, I thought I heard another pair behind me, a faint, deliberate rhythm just out of sync with my own. I glanced over my shoulder, but the street stretched out empty, dimly lit by the scattered glow of streetlights. The shadows seemed to ripple unnaturally at the edge of my vision, and my heart began to race. I quickened my pace, my breath shallow and uneven, the weight of my bag suddenly comforting, a feeble barrier against whatever unseen force might be following. Needing a distraction, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, the screen's glow casting a pale light onto my trembling fingers. I opened my GPS, wanting reassurance that I was on the right path. But as the map loaded, my stomach dropped. A blue dot moved in sync with me, following every step I took. It was close, too close. My chest tightened as a wave of panic washed over me. I froze in my tracks, my breath hitching, waiting to hear the unmistakable echo of footsteps stopping behind me. Slowly, I turned around, scanning the empty street with wide, desperate eyes. There was nothing there. I looked back at my phone. The dot was still there, still mirroring me. I felt the cold sting of sweat on my forehead as fear clenched my chest like a vice. Rational thoughts struggled to surface through the fog of terror. Maybe it was a glitch, I told myself. Just a technical error. But the explanation felt hollow. To test it, I took a cautious step to the left, then another to the right. The dot mimicked me perfectly, moving with a precision that sent shivers down my spine. My pulse pounded in my ears as I spun around again, half expecting someone to step out of the shadows. The emptiness of the street was almost worse. Desperation drove me to study the screen more closely. I zoomed in on the map, my vision blurring from the adrenaline coursing through me. Then, it hit me, the blue dot wasn't someone else. It was me. My phone had been tracking my own location all along. Relief and embarrassment washed over me in a dizzying wave. I let out a nervous laugh that sounded hollow in the stillness. My fear, my panic, it had all been for nothing. Just my overactive imagination playing tricks on me. Still, the unease clung to me like a second skin as I continued walking. The quiet of the night seemed unnaturally heavy, as if the city itself had turned its back on me. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was being foolish, but every rustle of leaves or distant sound made me flinch. When I finally reached my apartment building, the familiar glow of the lobby lights felt like a beacon of safety. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me with trembling hands. Leaning against it, I exhaled deeply, trying to calm my racing heart. Out of curiosity, and perhaps to prove to myself how ridiculous I'd been, I pulled out my phone again. The blue dot was still there, unmoving, right where I stood. It looked so harmless now, just a digital marker on a screen. But the memory of the fear I had felt lingered, a reminder of how easily the mind could twist the mundane into something monstrous. I laughed softly, the sound genuine this time, though the night's events replayed in my mind like a haunting refrain. Something about it still felt off. The streets had been too quiet, the shadows too alive. I made tea to settle my nerves, the soft whistle of the kettle cutting through the silence. As I sipped from my mug, I gazed out the kitchen window, my eyes scanning the empty street below. The flickering streetlights cast strange, distorted patterns on the pavement, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move where none should have been. I shook my head, brushing off the thought. It was just my imagination, I told myself. The night's tension was still clinging to me. Settling onto the couch, I turned on the TV, letting the noise fill the stillness. The earlier fear began to feel distant, like the fading remnants of a nightmare. But as I glanced out the window one last time, I couldn't ignore the creeping sensation at the back of my neck, that lingering, primal instinct whispering that I wasn't entirely alone. Some nights, the shadows felt too deep, the silence too heavy. And tonight was one of those nights. Story 7. Moving into the house had been a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was affordable, in a decent neighborhood, and the realtor's vague remarks about its history hadn't seemed significant at the time. Yes, it had been the site of a crime years ago, but the details were sketchy, and the renovations made it feel like any other house on the block. It seemed harmless, ordinary, even. The first few nights were uneventful. Still, I couldn't shake the occasional chill I felt in certain rooms. I brushed it off as poor insulation or first-time nerves about living alone. One evening, while unpacking boxes in the living room, I noticed a faint mark on the wall near the fireplace. It was barely noticeable, a thin scratch that seemed almost random. I assumed I'd overlooked it during the move and thought nothing of it. But then, over the following week, similar marks began to appear. In the hallway, a cluster of thin lines formed a deliberate-looking pattern. In the kitchen, near the light switch, there was a faint spiral etched into the wall. No amount of scrubbing could erase them. My unease began to grow. One night, I stayed up late working in my home office. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of floorboards. Stepping out for a glass of water, I froze when I saw a fresh mark on the wall by the staircase. This one was different, bolder, deeper, like it had been carved with intent. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself it had always been there. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The next morning, I called a locksmith and had all the locks changed. I installed a basic security system, hoping it would bring peace of mind. For a while, it worked. Weeks passed without incident, and I began to relax. Then one evening, I noticed a new mark in the bathroom. It was high up, near the ceiling, and shaped like an eye. My stomach churned as I stared at it, my reflection in the mirror pale and wide-eyed. It felt like a warning, though I couldn't say why. Determined to find answers, I dug deeper into the house's history. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Years ago, a man had lived here, a man convicted of unspeakable crimes. The symbols now appearing on my walls matched those found in his notebooks, strange, cryptic designs that defied explanation. The realization left me trembling. That night, I double-checked the locks, turned on every light, and stayed in the living room with the TV on for company. Around midnight, a faint scratching sound echoed from the hallway. It was subtle, like nails whispering against plaster, but it made my heart race. Grabbing a flashlight, I hesitated before stepping into the dark hallway. The sound stopped as soon as I turned the corner. My eyes darted to the walls, and there it was, a fresh mark, still glistening faintly, as if it had just been made. It was another spiral, larger than the others, pulsating in the dim light. Panic gripped me as I called the police. They found no signs of forced entry and suggested it might be a prank, or my imagination. Their indifference only deepened my fear. The marks kept appearing, sometimes in places I just cleaned. They began forming patterns, though I couldn't decipher them. I avoided certain rooms, especially the basement, where the air felt heavier, colder. Nights became unbearable, filled with subtle noises and shifting shadows that didn't belong. One evening, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, and silence pressed down like a weight. Using my phone's flashlight, I saw them, marks glowing faintly on every wall, spreading like a sinister web. My breath caught as they began forming words. Fragmented, but clear enough, "Get out." I bolted for the door, fumbling with the locks, and ran into the night. I didn't stop until I reached my car. Trembling, I stared back at the house, its windows dark and hollow. That night, I checked into a motel and called a friend, who urged me to leave for good. Over the next few days, I arranged to stay with family and returned during the day to pack my belongings. On my last trip, as I carried a box to the car, I glanced back at the house. The front door stood ajar, though I was sure I'd closed it. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw movement, a shadow that wasn't mine. My heart thundered as I quickly drove away, leaving the house behind for good. Months later, the new owners reached out. They asked if I'd noticed anything strange about the walls. My blood ran cold as they described marks that had begun appearing shortly after they moved in. I didn't know what to say, so I told them nothing. Some places, I realized, are better left behind. Story 8. It started so subtly, I almost convinced myself it wasn't real. I was sitting in my small apartment, the glow of the TV painting flickering shadows on the walls, when I noticed something move outside the window. I glanced over, but there was nothing there, just the still night and the faint rustle of leaves. Shrugging it off as a trick of the light, I returned to my show. But the feeling didn't leave me. That uneasy, skin-crawling sense that someone was watching lingered long after. The next night, it happened again. This time, I was at my desk, typing away on my laptop, when I saw him, a silhouette outside my window. My heart stuttered in my chest. I froze for a moment before instinct took over. Turning off the lights, I crept to the window and peeked through the blinds. He was gone, leaving behind only the whisper of wind in the courtyard. I told myself it had to be a neighbor or someone cutting through the complex. It was a ground floor apartment, after all. But that explanation didn't sit right. The figure had been too still, too deliberate. That night, I locked every window and drew the curtains tightly before crawling into bed. Days passed without incident, and I started to believe it had all been a misunderstanding. Then, I saw him again, standing farther back in the shadows this time. I couldn't make out his face, but his stance was tense, almost predatory. My chest tightened as I gathered what little courage I had. I flung the window open and shouted, "Who's there?" The figure shifted but didn't answer. Then, just as silently as he had appeared, he melted into the darkness. The next morning, I reported it to the building manager. He waved me off, muttering something about kids cutting through the courtyard. "Happens all the time," he said, dismissive. I left his office frustrated and unsettled, but what else could I do? For a while, it seemed like the man had disappeared. I began to relax, convincing myself it was over. Then, late one night, I heard it, footsteps outside my window. My stomach clenched as I crept to the curtain and peeked out. He was closer this time. The dim glow of a nearby street lamp illuminated part of his face. It was blank. Emotionless. Grabbing my phone, I rushed outside, dialing the police with trembling hands. But to my shock, he didn't run. He just stood there, staring at me with that unnerving calmness. "What are you doing outside my window?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "I wasn't near your window," he replied flatly, his voice devoid of emotion. A chill ran down my spine. I had seen him there. Hadn't I? By the time the police arrived, he was gone. They took my statement but didn't seem optimistic about catching him. Over the next few days, the paranoia grew. I felt his eyes on me, even in broad daylight. I double-checked locks, avoided windows, and flinched at every sound. Desperate, I installed a security camera. For a few nights, it recorded nothing unusual. Then, on the fourth night, I woke to a notification. Motion detected. My hands trembled as I opened the app. There he was, staring directly into the lens. His expression was unreadable, but the sight of him sent a jolt of terror through me. The police increased their patrols, but it didn't stop him. He kept coming back. Each time, he lingered a little longer, daring me to act. I started sleeping with a baseball bat by my bed, but it did little to ease the constant dread. One night, loud banging on my window jolted me awake. Clutching the bat, I rushed to the window. He was gone, but the glass was smeared with handprints. The visits became less frequent after that, but they never stopped entirely. Each appearance was a fresh reminder that I was being hunted, toyed with. I printed a still from the security footage and showed it to my neighbors. Most didn't recognize him, but one older woman hesitated. "He used to live here," she said quietly. "Got evicted years ago. Made people uncomfortable." Her words only deepened my dread. That night, I heard his footsteps again. But this time, I didn't look. I sat frozen in the dark, clutching the bat and listening as he moved closer, then farther away. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Whether it was the increased police presence or my refusal to engage, I'll never know. But the fear he left behind didn't vanish with him. Even now, I can't sit near a window without glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see his shadow in the dark. Story 9. One quiet night, I sat alone in my living room, scrolling aimlessly on my phone. The faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling were the only sounds accompanying me. Yet, despite the stillness, an inexplicable sensation began to creep over me, a nagging, almost primal feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to brush it off as paranoia, but the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. As the hours dragged on, the sensation intensified. My eyes kept flicking to the darkened corners of the room, where the shadows seemed to stretch and shift. Every time I focused, nothing was there, but the weight of unseen eyes pressed down on me, heavier with each passing moment. Deciding I couldn't ignore it anymore, I turned to the security cameras I'd installed a few months back after a rash of neighborhood break-ins. At my desk, I pulled up the live feeds on my computer. The screens showed the front porch, the backyard, and the living room where I sat. Everything appeared normal at first. But then, on the backyard feed, I noticed something, a faint shape at the far edge of the frame, near the tree line. It was indistinct, blurry, but unmistakably humanoid. My pulse quickened as I leaned closer to the screen, trying to make out what it was. A trick of the light, I told myself. But deep down, I couldn't believe it. Hoping to calm my nerves, I switched to the front porch camera. The feed showed the empty street and the warm glow of the porch light. Nothing seemed out of place, yet that oppressive feeling of being watched clung to me like a second skin. My gaze drifted back to the backyard feed. The figure was still there, motionless, as if waiting. Heart hammering, I decided to turn on the backyard floodlights. Bright beams cut through the darkness, illuminating the yard. And just like that, the figure was gone. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Something about the empty yard felt wrong, like the calm before a storm. I turned off the lights and tried to settle back in the living room, but the unease only grew. Minutes later, the sensation of being watched came roaring back, stronger than before. Then, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was soft at first, like fingers drumming on glass. My breath hitched as I strained to locate the source. It seemed to come from the kitchen window. Each step I took toward the sound felt heavier than the last, my heart pounding in my ears. When I finally peeked outside, the yard was empty. The tapping stopped, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. Shaken, I rushed back to the computer and reviewed the camera feeds. At first, everything seemed normal. But then, on the living room feed, I noticed something chilling, a shadowy figure standing behind the couch where I had been sitting earlier. My blood ran cold. Rewinding the footage, I watched in horror as the figure lingered in the frame for a moment before vanishing into thin air. Trembling, I scanned the room around me. Every shadow, every corner seemed alive with menace, but there was nothing there. Gripping my phone, I debated calling the police. What would I even say? That I thought I saw a shadow on a camera? Instead, I grabbed a flashlight and searched the house room by room, closet by closet, my heart in my throat the entire time. Every empty space brought a mix of relief and dread, as if I were playing a twisted game of hide-and-seek with something I couldn't see. Exhausted but no closer to an explanation, I slumped back onto the couch, hoping to distract myself with the TV. Just as I began to relax, the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a heartbeat before returning. My gaze darted to the security monitor. The backyard feed was now completely black, as if something had covered the lens. Summoning every ounce of courage, I grabbed a coat and stepped outside to check. The air was frigid, the silence unnaturally thick. When I reached the camera, I found it working perfectly, nothing was obstructing it. But standing in the vast, oppressive darkness of the yard, I felt exposed. Vulnerable. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. Back at the monitor, I replayed the last few minutes of the backyard feed. My stomach dropped as I watched the shadowy figure reappear, closer this time. It moved slowly, deliberately, before the feed abruptly cut to black. Then, the tapping returned. Louder now, more insistent, coming from the window directly behind me. I didn't dare turn around. Instead, I kept my eyes glued to the screen. The front porch feed showed the figure standing motionless, just outside the door. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. The only thing separating us was a deadbolt and a thin layer of wood. My breath came in shallow gasps as I bolted to the door, double-checking the locks. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. Desperate for some semblance of control, I turned on every light in the house. When I finally mustered the courage to look at the monitor again, the figure was gone. The porch was empty, as if nothing had ever been there. Sleep was impossible that night. I sat awake until dawn, the security monitor my only company. When the first rays of sunlight finally bled through the windows, the sense of dread began to ebb, but it never truly left. The figure had disappeared, but its presence lingered, etched into the fabric of my home. I reinforced the locks and had the cameras professionally inspected. But no amount of preparation could shake the memory of that shadowy figure, watching me from the dark. I don't think I'll ever feel alone in my house again. Story 10. It began late one night, when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer, thinking it was just a wrong number, but some inexplicable pull, compelled me to pick it up. A calm voice on the other end greeted me with an unsettlingly quiet tone. "Did you enjoy the coffee you had at 3:15 today?" My stomach churned. How could they possibly know? They described the cafe I'd visited, even the green jacket I had worn. Panic surged through me. I demanded to know who they were, but the line went dead. I sat there, frozen, staring at the phone, hoping it was a sick prank. But when the calls kept coming, day after day, I realized something far worse was at play. The caller knew things, details about my life, my routines, my every move. The food I ate, the places I visited, even the exact time I napped. What terrified me most was how ordinary their voice sounded. There was no anger, no menace, just a disturbingly calm familiarity. Each call felt like an invasion, as if they were peeling away the layers of my privacy, one by one. I became a prisoner in my own home. I stopped going out unless absolutely necessary, constantly glancing over my shoulder. I contacted my phone provider, desperate for answers, but they could offer me nothing. Weeks would pass before they could trace the number, they said. Frustrated and terrified, I downloaded a tracking app, praying it would lead to some simple explanation. When the results appeared, my blood ran cold. The number was registered to my own address. At first, I thought it was a glitch, some mistake, but the more I thought about it, the more sinister it became. Who could be calling me from my own house? That night, I scoured every room, closets, under the beds, even the attic, though I hated the dark, suffocating space. There was no sign of anyone, no trace of the presence that seemed to hover over me. I locked every door, every window, and checked again and again before retreating to my bedroom. But the calls didn't stop. They grew even more precise. One night, the voice described a dream I'd had the previous evening in perfect detail. Another time, they recited a conversation I'd had with a coworker that very day. I started sleeping with the lights on, terrified to be alone in the dark. I tried to tell a friend, but they just laughed it off, suggesting I was overreacting, imagining things. Their disbelief only deepened my isolation. I stopped answering their calls, retreating further into myself, consumed by fear of what might come next. One evening, desperate for some peace, I unplugged the landline and turned off my cell. I thought, maybe if I cut off all contact, the caller would lose their grip on me. For a few blissful hours, there was nothing but silence. I finally allowed myself to breathe again. Then, around midnight, it rang. My phone, though powered off, began to ring. The sound came from somewhere deep within the house. My chest tightened, a cold dread creeping over me. I followed the muffled noise down to the basement. The old rotary phone that hadn't worked in years was ringing. Frozen, I stared at it, my heart pounding, until the receiver clicked. I lifted it to my ear, trembling. The voice greeted me as if we were old friends. "I've been waiting for you to answer this one." I slammed the phone down and bolted upstairs, locking the basement door behind me. The next morning, I packed a bag and fled the house, unable to endure another night there. I checked into a motel on the outskirts of town, hoping the distance would help me clear my head. For a few days, it worked. My phone stayed silent. I almost began to feel normal again. But then, as I sat in the motel room, the phone rang. When I picked it up, that same calm voice greeted me once more, "Running won't help." I dropped the phone in horror, my heart hammering in my chest. How had they found me? I checked out of the motel in a panic, driving aimlessly for hours, unsure of where to go. There was no escape. Exhausted, I finally decided to return to the house and confront whatever had been tormenting me. The drive back was filled with dread, but by the time I arrived, the sun was setting, casting long, twisted shadows across the yard. The house felt colder than I remembered, as if it had been waiting for me. Inside, nothing had changed. Yet, as I entered the basement, I found the old phone off the hook again, even though I was certain I had hung it up before leaving. Standing there, I felt the unmistakable presence behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The realization hit me like a bolt of lightning: the voice had never needed the phone to reach me. The calls had only been a way to lure me back to this place. The lights flickered. The air grew heavy. I stumbled up the stairs, my mind racing with fear. When I reached the front door, it wouldn't open. No matter how hard I pulled, it remained sealed. Behind me, the phone in the basement began to ring once more. Panicking, I ran to the nearest window and smashed it with a chair, desperate to escape. As I climbed through the broken glass, I felt the house, cold and hungry, trying to pull me back in. I collapsed on the lawn, gasping for air, and never looked back. I sold the house without ever stepping foot inside again. The calls stopped. But sometimes, when the night is quiet and the world is still, I catch myself listening, for a phone that isn't there.